Can you hear me? Okay, let's start. Already 6-7 minutes late. Dmitry, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to present the paper here. Very glad to be here. So this is a joint work with Oleg Etschoki, and as the title suggests, the paper is about optimal exchange rate policy. So in particular, what we try to understand in this paper is whether it's optimal for countries to intervene in the currency markets, right? So the standard kind of conventional wisdom, which goes back at least to the work of Milton Friedman, is that central banks should focus on full employment, price stability, and allow exchange rates to freely flow to bring relative prices across countries to the efficient level, right? At the same time, when we look in the data, we know that many countries in the world do intervene in the currency markets, right? So according to Ilzetsky, Reinhardt, and Rogov, about 70% of countries manage the exchange rate. Not necessarily fixing the exchange rates, but having something like a crawling peg, a dirty float, a corridor system. So they are somewhere between a freely floating regime and a fixed exchange rate. And we try to understand why that might be the case. So is it just that policymakers are stupid, or maybe we're missing something important in our models? And then there is the second closely related question, namely how exactly you implement this crawling peg or a dirty float, right? So again, in practice, we see that countries use some mix of interest rate policy, capital controls, FX interventions, which begs the question whether there is some pecking order of instruments, whether it's better to use one instrument than the other. So obviously, we are not the first one, right? There's a big literature, thousands and thousands of papers on the subject. So why are we not fully satisfied with existing literature? Well, the main issue is that the standard conventional models that we use to answer these questions, they are usually completely at odds with the data in terms of their positive predictions, right? So if you think about the most cited papers on the subject, like Galli-Monachelli, Devreux-Engel, Clarida-Galli-Görtler, etc., right? So you can pick almost any exchange rate moment, compare it in the model and in the data, and you will get a puzzle. Right? So in particular, dynamics of exchange rate with the prices will give you a purchasing power parity puzzle. Then for moment of exchange rates with interest rates will give you UIP puzzle, exchange rates and consumption Backus-Smith puzzle, exchange rate dynamics Mises-Rogov puzzle, and so on and so forth. Right? So it's a bit schizophrenic. We know that those are kind of terrible models of exchange rates, but we trust their normative predictions, their policy predictions. So in this paper, we try to make some progress, and we take a slightly different route. So we start with our previous work with Oleg, and let me just very briefly just spend a couple of minutes to summarize, because I think it's important to motivate the framework that we use in this paper. So we use our previous work where we try to explain these puzzles. Okay, and so here's the brief summary, kind of summary of two papers in one slide. So the upper panel here shows dynamics of the real exchange rate of the US against 7 other countries. This is the dynamics of changes in consumption. And this is starting from 1973, so this is post-Bretton Woods period. This is the period when countries had a floating exchange rate regime. Again, so what you can see immediately from this picture is the disconnect puzzle, right? Exchange rates are much more volatile than other macro variables. And if you compute the correlation between the two series, it's very unstable, and on average it is equal 0. Okay? And so that's the disconnect. This is the puzzle that we addressed in our first paper, and what we showed there is that you need a very particular shock to explain this puzzle, right? So you need to add financial shock, which shows up as a UIP wedge in this condition, right? So this is the returns on domestic bonds, this is the returns on foreign bonds. A naive no arbitrage condition would tell you that these returns should be equalized on average, and we know that in the data that's not the case, right? And once you add this financial shock, then you can explain all these puzzles simultaneously, right? So that was kind of the argument in the first paper. So now, is it a good news or a bad news? Well, the question is, what are the micro foundations for this financial shock, right? And in a sense, it turns out that it's a very robust result. If you only want to explain these pictures, if you only want to explain exchange rates under the floating regime, then you don't really care much about the micro foundations. You can write a model where this comes from segmented financial markets, it can come from convenience yields, whatever we mean by that. It can come from complete markets model with large risk premium. So as long as you have this shock, which is not very much correlated with productivity shocks, demand shocks, etc., you are able to match all these moments. So in that sense, there is robustness. The problem is, of course, that you can't do normative analysis without micro foundations, right? So if it's completely exogenous shock, then it's like a shock to the foreign interest rate for a small open economy, and then all these results of Galli-Monachelli and previous literature still go through. On the other hand, if this financial shock is endogenous to monetary policy, then the whole analysis is subject to the Lucas critique, and the optimal policy might look very differently. Okay? So how do we know, right? So how can we make progress in understanding the source of this financial shock? Well, what we do, we follow, you know, the very famous paper by Musa, and we compare the dynamics of variables before 1973 and after 1973, right? So that's kind of one of the biggest natural experiments in international economics, the switch between a fixed exchange rate during the Bretton Woods period to the floating regime. And so what we see from the data is that on the one hand, there is a dramatic change in the volatility of the real exchange rate, right? So that was original Musa finding, right? So it's increased almost tenfold, the volatility of the real exchange rate. But at the same time, there is almost no change in the dynamics of other macro variables. So again, this is example with consumption, but you can look at output, investment, inflation, almost any other macro variable, and there's just no structural break whatsoever in 1973. Okay? And so that's kind of a much broader Musa puzzle, in the sense that you want a model in which macro volatility doesn't change and only exchange rate volatility changes when you switch between a float and a peg. Okay? And so what we argue in our second paper is that the model which can rationalize this is the model in which financial shock is endogenous to monetary policy, right? So it's a little bit, this picture shows, it's a little bit like you switch off this financial shock when you move from a float to a peg, okay? And nothing else changes in the economy. And so this will be exactly the model that I'm going to show you today, and this will be the model which we use to do, to derive optimal policy. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so what happens next? So once we introduce this mechanism into the model, we now have that there are two channels for which exchange rate policy affects equilibrium allocations. So just like in the previous literature, there's still expenditure switching in the goods markets, right? So when the exchange rate depreciates, domestic goods become cheaper, and so demand for them increases. But on top of that, there's also now the risk-sharing channel in financial markets, right? So the change in the monetary policy, as I showed, it changes this, the properties of this financial shock, the UIP wedge, and that changes the risk sharing across countries, okay? And so that will be another motive for the optimal policy. So what we do next, we show that this model can be, you know, this policy problem can be expressed in a linear quadratic form, just like in Clarida-Galli-Görtler or Galli-Monticelli, right? So there will be an objective, quadratic objective function with output gap, with inflation, and then on top of that there will be also cost of imperfect risk sharing. And then there will be a bunch of linear constraints. And so once you have this problem, you can easily revisit all these classical questions, right? What is the optimal targets for the monetary policy? What is the optimal use of different instruments? Whether there is divine coincidence? What is the benefits of forward guidance and international coordination? So I will probably not have time to show all the results, but I will try to convince you that this framework is useful to think about these issues. Okay, so let me jump straight to the model to economize time. So the model is super simple, okay? And so I'm intentionally show you the simplest possible version of the model. Okay, so in the paper we extended in many different directions, but for now, just, you know, I would argue that this is the simplest possible version of the model, which is still consistent, at least qualitatively, with these key puzzles that I showed you before. So think of a small open economy with two goods, tradables and non-tradables. The household problem is completely standard. Okay, so in particular, households have log linear preferences. Gamma is the share of tradables. 1 minus gamma is the share of non-tradables. So you can think of 1 minus gamma as home bias, and gamma is the openness of the economy. Households collect labor income. They get some profits from firms. They get some transfers from the government. They decide how to allocate this income between tradable goods and non-tradable goods, and they make some borrowing and saving decisions. Okay, and they only use local currency bonds or deposits to make savings and borrowing. On the production side, there are two sectors. There are tradables and non-tradables. Again, to keep things as simple as possible, I'm going to assume that the endowment in the tradable sector is exogenous. Okay, so this YT is exogenous, but it is stochastic. Okay, and so that generates demand for international risk sharing. Right? There are periods when a country has a lot of tradables, there are periods when it doesn't have much tradables, and so it wants to use international risk sharing, international borrowing and saving to smooth consumption of tradables in time. The low bound price holds, so that if the price of tradables is $1, then in local currency, this price moves 1-to-1 with the nominal exchange rate. And as usual, right, when exchange rate goes up, it means that the exchange rate depreciates. The local currency becomes weaker. In the non-tradable sector, output is endogenous, so it depends on labor. And again, to simplify, I will go to the extreme. I'm going to assume that prices are fully sticky in local currency. Again, this is not, you know, you don't really need this. You can replace it with Calvo friction, but To keep things simple, let's assume that prices are fully sticky. Okay, so far nothing really new. So it's a stripped down version of Galli Monticelli or any other model in this literature. So here comes the interesting part. So we're going to introduce the second main friction. So on top of sticky prices, we also assume that financial markets are segmented. Okay, and so in particular, domestic households can only trade local currency bond, right? They can only borrow and save using local currency bonds, and foreign households can only use foreign currency bonds. And so all international capital flows have to go through these arbitrageurs in financial markets. Okay? So it's very similar to Gabay and Maggiore. The main difference, however, is that arbitrageurs are not financially constrained. Okay? So they are allowed to take any positions that they like, and instead, the limits to arbitrage come from the fact that they are risk averse. So in particular, every period there is a new generation of these arbitrageurs. They start with net zero wealth. They decide how to borrow in one currency and how much to invest in the other currency, right? So they do carry trade. Okay, so they borrow kind of in cheap currency, they invest in the currency which was expected higher returns. Next period, they collect returns on this carry trade and they transfer it to households. Okay, so they don't consume themselves, they just transfer this either profits or losses to households. So what is their objective? Well, they have mean variance preferences. Again, in principle, one can start with more general preferences and then do some approximations, but for now, let me just focus on mean variance preferences. Okay, so what do we have here? So this is their wealth after they collect returns on carry trade. This is household stochastic discount factor. And so in principle, if omega is equal 0, if we kind of abstract from the second term, then they have the same preferences as households. In fact, you can show that if omega goes to 0, then this segmentation doesn't bite, right? So households cannot trade foreign bonds, but arbitrageurs do that for them, and arbitrageurs have exactly the same preferences as a representative household. So what makes the model interesting, what makes this friction bite, is the assumption that these arbitrageurs, they are also risk averse. So there is some, in equilibrium, they will require some risk premium, which compensates for them for doing this carry trade. Okay? And then finally, just to close the model, there are two other agents which participate in the currency market. There is the government, which does FX interventions, so it sells bonds in one currency in exchange for the bonds in the other currency. And then there are noise traders. Okay? So that will be the key shock in financial markets. There are these kind of habitat guys who inelastically supply and demand to currencies. Okay, so that's probably the part of the model that we are not super happy about, not super proud of, right? It's a bit of a black box in a sense. So who are these noise traders? I can tell you some stories, but I think this is largely an open question empirically, right? So in a sense, I would say that any asset pricing model has this dark meta flavor, right? We know that it's very hard to explain asset prices with just observables. You always need some source of variation, some shock, which you can't really directly observe. You can only infer from, asset prices. And so in our model, this is this shock, right? The noise trader shock. So what would be the stories that I can tell you is something like, you have a, let's say, German company opening a plant in Brazil. It expects some profits from that plant, from that factory, but it doesn't want to hold any currency risk. And so then to kind of hedge against that risk, it will demand these bonds. And so no matter what the exchange rate is today, no matter what are the interest rates, they just don't want to hold any of this risk. And so that's why they introduce demand shocks in this market. Okay, just to wrap up here, so let me emphasize that. So what is important? Two frictions, right? Sticky prices, which make output demand determined, and segmentation, which makes risk sharing imperfect in financial markets. Then there are two policy instruments, the nominal interest rate set by the central bank and the FX interventions in the currency market. So the rest is not really important, right? The rest can be generalized. You can have more general preferences, you can allow for incomplete pass-through, you can have Calvo friction, and you can even allow less extreme forms of segmentation where households can also trade foreign currency but subject to some portfolio adjustment costs. Okay, so now before I show you the optimal policy, let me start with the social planner's problem, right? So let me show you what is the first best allocation that the planner would like to implement if it could. So here's just the standard social planner problem, right? The maximization of preferences subject to two resource constraints. One is the static resource constraint in the non-tradable market, and then another one is the intertemporal budget constraint for tradables. So as usual, the optimal trade-off between consumption and leisure gives you that output in the non-tradable sector moves with productivity shocks, and then the optimal intertemporal consumption smoothing for tradables is characterized by the Euler equation. Okay, so this C tildes, they denote the first best allocation in this model. So given this first best allocation, we can now define two wedges which play an important role in our analysis. Okay, so the first one is the output gap, how much output in the non-tradable sector deviates from the first best. So that's exactly the same definition, the same object that we also have in a closed economy. The second wedge is new. This is how much consumption of tradable goods deviates from the efficient level, and I'm going to call this a risk-sharing wedge. Okay, so this wedge arises when this Euler condition is not satisfied, when for some reason households cannot perfectly smooth consumption in time. And so so if you take the second order approximation to the planner's problem, you can show that the objective function looks like this. Okay, so it's a weighted average, kind of the loss function is a weighted average of losses from output gap and the losses from the imperfect risk sharing. Okay, so notice that there is no inflation here. This is because we assumed fully sticky prices, right? So once you switch to Calva friction, there will be also additional costs coming from inflation. So this is the objective function. Now, what are the constraints? So the first constraint comes from the intertemporal budget constraints. So if we linearize this condition, we get an equation which looks like this. Remember, this is all in deviations from the first best. So this is not just the net foreign asset position, this is the deviation of the net foreign asset position from the first best level. And you can think of this wedge, now it's not just a risk sharing wedge, but it's also how much net export deviates from the efficient level. So you can think in terms of inefficient capital flows or inefficient trade balance. Okay? So of course, if this were the only constraint, then the solution is trivial, right? You just set all these wedges to 0 and you are back to the first best allocation. What makes the problem interesting that there are two additional constraints which come from two frictions. Okay? So let's start with the goods market. So in the goods market, there are sticky prices, and that will already generate additional constraint. Okay, so this is just the optimal demand of households for non-tradables versus tradables, which depends on the relative price of these two goods. And because prices of non-tradables are sticky, this relative price moves one-to-one with the nominal exchange rate. Okay, so when exchange rate depreciates, it means that tradable becomes more expensive, and so demand for non-tradable goods relative to tradables increases. Okay, so then again, we take the first order approximation. I mean, here it's exact. Everything is exact in logs, and so we get an equation which in equilibrium determines the nominal exchange rate. Okay? So there are three components here. The first one is what we call the natural real exchange rate. Okay? So just like there is a natural level of unemployment, natural real interest rate. This is the level of the real exchange rate which would prevail in an efficient economy. So absent frictions, if there were no sticky prices and no financial frictions, this is the real exchange rate that should appear in equilibrium, right? So we should observe in equilibrium. So this is I will call this natural real exchange rate. And then there are two gaps, right? So one is this gap coming from non-tradable goods, the output gap, and then there's this wedge which comes from tradable sector. So for example, if you have stimulative monetary policy, which increases output gap, which makes output gap positive, that leads to depreciation, right? You have more tradable goods. To support consumption of non-tradable goods, you need to make them cheaper, so you need the exchange rate to depreciate. On the other hand, if you have capital inflows, right, ZT is positive, then exchange rate appreciates. So that's the goods markets. So now, more interestingly, what happens in financial markets, right? So that's the second, the source of second friction. So here, again, let me skip a few derivations. Let me just show you the resulting risk-sharing condition. Okay, so this is what we get. So the blue part is exactly the same risk-sharing condition that we have in the social planner's problem. Okay, so if omega is equal to 0, again, if arbitrageurs are not risk-averse, then we are back to the efficient risk-sharing, right, and we get the standard Euler equation. On the other hand, as long as there is segmentation, right, and households have to go through the arbitrageurs, and these arbitrageurs are risk-averse, there will be additional term here, which is the risk premium. And it depends on the risk aversion of these guys, omega. It depends on the riskiness of carry trade. And the risk of carry trades comes from volatility of the nominal exchange rate, right? So the only thing that arbitrageurs don't know when they do carry trade is the future nominal exchange rate. Okay, so this sigma squared is the volatility of the nominal exchange rate. And then finally, the last term is the gross positions that these arbitrageurs have to absorb, right? So this is net demand of households, noise traders, and the government. So this is in equilibrium how the gross positions that arbitrageurs have to hold, and of course, the larger these positions, the higher will be the risk premium that they charge. So let me just say one more thing here is that the key difference of our model from the previous literature, because there has been much work done on the FX interventions and currency markets, is this sigma squared, right? So the fact that volatility of the exchange rate does affect the risk premium endogenously. Okay, so very last step in derivation. So okay, again, right, we want to get this linear quadratic policy problem. So we need to kind of linearize this constraint. But of course, if you do it in a standard way, then this risk premium will drop out, right? You have sigma squared here. This is already second order moment. So of course, under the first order approximation, it's just 0. And then we kind of go back to this blue part, and that makes the model completely uninteresting. I mean, you get exactly the same results as the previous literature. So what we do instead, we use kind of unconventional approximation to preserve, to keep this risk premium, right? So we take a limit where shocks become smaller and smaller, and so volatility goes to 0. But at the same time, the kind of risk-bearing capacity of the financial sector goes to 0 as well, or risk aversion goes to infinity, right? And so once you do it, in a proper way, you preserve this risk premium so it stays as the first order term. And so this is what you get, right? So this is still the UIP wedge, the risk-sharing wedge. It still depends on the positions that arbitrageurs have to absorb, and it also depends on the volatility. Okay, and so this whole term is the first order. And of course, in principle, we could take any limit, right? So mathematically, any limit is kosher. There's no discipline coming from just mathematical point of view. So we think that the right way to do this approximation is to discipline this approximation is by looking at the empirical moments. And we know that in the data, this risk premium is large, right? It's kind of the same order of magnitude as dynamics of other macro variables. And so that's kind of the rationale for taking this particular limit. Okay, perfect. So finally, here's the policy problem, right? So objective function, budget constraint, risk sharing condition, and the equilibrium in the goods markets. So notice that we only have 2 shocks left, right? So this is the only financial shock left, the noise trader shock. And then this natural real exchange rate, it kind of subsumes all fundamental macro shocks, right? So productivity in 2 sectors, the global interest rate, they are all condensed to this natural real exchange rate. Okay, so I need to speed up. Let me now kind of do it in the Karagedikli style. So I will just show you some results very quickly, some main policy lessons. So the first one is that we get something like a relaxed trilemma, right? So in the sense that even without any capital controls, the monetary policy now has 2 instruments, so it can still implement inward-looking policy, let's say close output gap, XT, but at the same time, it can still use the second instrument, right, the FX interventions, to change the dynamics of the exchange rate. Of course, it doesn't mean that the planner can set any exchange rate. It's not like Argentina can appreciate its exchange rate by 20% permanently. You can appreciate it temporarily, but then it means that in the long run, exchange rate needs to depreciate. So that's what the planner can do. Now, what is optimal? So let's start with the simple case when the planner can choose both instruments. So in this case, you get this separation result. I think that's what Pierre-Olivier referred to yesterday, right? So that you have 2 instruments and 2 different objectives. The monetary policy, the interest rate policy, is used to close output gap and to stabilize prices. And the FX interventions are used to close the UIP wedge, right, to eliminate these inefficient deviations in financial markets. So notice in our model, it's really UIP. It's not CIP because we don't have CIP deviations here. Empirically, UIP deviations are much larger, and presumably there is some fundamental component there as well. So to be more precise, what kind of the model tells you is that you want to eliminate the part of the UIP which is due to this intermediary friction. Okay? And of course, notice that, right, even though the policy does intervene in the currency markets, it doesn't target the exchange rate level or even volatility here, right? It's only about the elimination of the UIP wedge. So from slightly different perspective, you can also characterize, you can think of the optimum policy in terms of its response to different types of shock, right? So again, if you remember Karagedikli, they talk a lot about optimal policy offsetting demand shocks and accommodating productivity shocks. So here we have something similar. FX policy fully offsets noise trader shocks, non-fundamental shocks, but it fully accommodates macro-fundamental shocks, right? It allows exchange rates to respond to these fundamental shocks. Of course, it's much easier, to say it in theory, to get it in theory, than to implement it in practice, because who knows what is this natural level of the real exchange rate, who knows. It's actually even hard to estimate UIP deviations, because that involves estimating conditional expectations, right? So it's, of course, there are all these caveats, but on the other hand, it's not that different from closed economy, where we also talk about potential output, natural level of unemployment, natural interest rate. All these objects are not observable, right? So it's, implementation requires some art, as Alan Blinder said. Okay, so this was kind of the benchmark, right? So now let's think of this kind of more challenging case when the only policy instrument that the planner has is monetary policy, the interest rate policy. So why is that an interesting case? Well, because in practice, many countries might not be able to use FX interventions, right? So on the one hand, some countries just don't have enough reserves. Again, imagine Argentina running out of reserves, right? Then they can't really support their currency. On the other hand, there is cases like Switzerland, so they definitely have a lot of reserves, right? But they are worried that if they accumulate even more reserves, then they will be very much exposed to negative shocks, right? So if exchange rate or asset prices move against them, they will have huge negative valuation effects, and that will kind of compromise the central bank, right? Because eventually it will be kind of taxpayers who absorb these losses. And so then in that case you can get something like a value at risk constraint. So it's natural to ask that if the central bank completely gives up on using FX instruments, what should it do with interest rate policy? And here, if you think about ex post interventions, right? Suppose you have a capital outflow shock, and you can only change interest rate today. So it turns out that that's not very efficient, and I think it kind of goes against some logic that we discussed yesterday. It's a bit of a special case. It relies on separable utility, no input-output linkages, but I think it's an interesting benchmark, and I'm actually very curious empirically how much this is true. So if you change the interest rate ex post, of course that will help you to change the exchange rate. That's for sure. But in this model, it will not change capital flows at all. Right? It will not change net exports, it will not change positions of these arbitrageurs, and as a result, it will not affect UIP premium. Okay, so in that sense, ex post monetary interventions, they have no effect on the risk sharing. Which is not to say that monetary policy can do anything. Instead, it can be quite powerful. It's just the ex ante policy rather than ex post policy. So, in fact, there is a special case which we call open economy divine coincidence, when one monetary policy instrument can close both gaps. It can close simultaneously output gap and also eliminate the risk sharing wedge. So just like, again, in the closed economy, right, so for the divine coincidence, in the closed economy, you need no markup shocks. So here you need to assume that the natural first best real exchange rate is fully stable, right? So suppose you have the same shocks in tradable and non-tradable sector so that the relative price doesn't move. So in that case, the monetary policy can just peg nominal exchange rate, and that will be enough to eliminate both wedges. So why is that? And this is really, this is where we rely very much on our model. So if exchange rate is fully stabilized, then there is no risk in the currency market. Okay, and so all these arbitrageurs, they know that carry trade is riskless, and they are willing to take any positions to eliminate any UIP wedges. Okay, so monetary policy does not directly affect capital flows, but it can incentivize arbitrageurs to take larger positions, and by that indirectly eliminate any UIP wedges. Okay, and that has some interesting implications for the optimal currency area literature, right? So we know very well what are the costs of having common currency among different countries, but the model also shows what can be additional gains, right? And in some sense, if you look at the Eurozone, we know that during 2000s there was convergence of spreads across countries. Maybe it's due to implicit fiscal policy, right, implicit transfers, but maybe it's also partially due to this elimination of the currency risk, like in our model. And I should say that there's an important caveat. So all this kind of works only if you have default-free bonds, like in our market, right? Once you introduce some risk of default, actually capital flows can become very fickle, and in some sense having fully fixed exchange rate becomes much worse than a floating regime. Okay, so this is an extreme case, right? This divine coincidence case, it's an interesting benchmark, but clearly this assumption doesn't hold for most countries in the world. So what happens if there are shocks to the natural real exchange rate? What is the optimum policy? Well, then there is no divine coincidence. The planner has to trade off optimally, output stability and the risk premium, and so this is the optimal policy rule. Okay, so and what is interesting, and this is what we can get with our approximation, is that this optimal rule is state contingent. So in the states of the world where there are no capital flows, right, inflows or outflows, the planner just focuses on stabilizing output gap. This is kind of normal times. But once you're in a crisis period, right, when there is large, let's say, capital outflow, then the planner starts to put more weight on the second objective, and it tries to stabilize exchange rate to incentivize arbitrageurs to eliminate these noise trader shocks, right? And so it promises to bring exchange rate in the next period closer to the average value to stabilize to smooth movements in the exchange rate. And that looks very much like a crawling peg, right? This is where I started. This is the regime that many countries in the world have. So there are many interesting properties. Let me, in the interest of time, skip this. Let me just say that, right, you have this interesting forward guidance in a sense. So even if the FX policy or monetary policy cannot do much today, it can still promise to do many things in the future to stabilize the exchange rate, and that will already help to eliminate the wedge today. And of course, this only works if monetary policy is credible, right? Because it is all based on promises about future exchange rate process, right? It's not about today's policy. So if instead you solve for the optimal discretionary policy, then the planner just focuses on output gap. There's nothing better it can do. Okay, so I think this is will be my last slide since I'm running out of time, which kind of summarizes what I told you. Okay, so this is, I think it was actually Maury Opsfeld who pushed us hard to provide some graphical illustration, and eventually we managed to do this. I mean, it's not trivial because in contrast to the standard New Keynesian models, we had to work in the dimension of the second moments. Okay, so this is the volatility of the output gap, and this is volatility of the nominal exchange rate. Okay, and so if we go back to the standard case, and these are the two equations that we have in the model, right? So let's start with the standard case. I think this is the case that Milton Friedman had in his mind. So the case of trilemma when capital flows are efficient in the sense that these arbitrageurs, they're almost risk neutral, so they can, take very large positions. In this case, gamma becomes 0. So as a result, the risk-sharing wedge Z is also equal 0. And then the only question for the monetary policy is how you allocate this fundamental volatility, productivity shock volatility, between output gap and the nominal exchange rate, right? So this is the blue line here. This is the trade-off. And of course, we don't care about exchange rate volatility per se, right? This is, that doesn't enter our welfare. So we only care about output gap. And of course, we want to bring this volatility to 0, which means that this will be the first best, right? This will be first best, and this will be floating, completely floating exchange rate regime, while peg is somewhere here. So what is the problem with this argument? Well, as I said, right, that the Musa puzzle. So if we compare Bretton Woods period with post-Bretton Woods period, we see increase in the exchange rate, but we don't see dramatic change in the volatility of other macro variables. And so in that sense, it seems like we're not in this trilemma world. Instead, what we have in our model is that this gamma, it's not 0. There is a limited risk-bearing capacity of the financial sector, and it depends on the volatility of the exchange rate. Okay, and so if you under peg, you have exactly the same equilibrium. But once you start deviating from the peg, the volatility of exchange rate goes up, right? There is now risk in the financial markets, and so the pass-through of financial shocks, noise trader shocks, into exchange rate increases, right? So endogenously, this gamma becomes larger and pass-through increases, and so the further you go away from the peg, the larger will be this endogenous volatility. Okay, and that's exactly how we explain the Musa puzzle. So we can get very large change in the exchange rate with almost no change in the output and inflation volatility here. Yeah, and so this is kind of our model, and in this case, if you have two instruments, you eliminate noise trader shocks with FX interventions, so you kind of go back from red line to the blue line, and then again you go to a floating regime. On the other hand, if you have only one instrument, then you have to choose the point on this red line, and then there's some managed flow, this internal solution. Okay, just very last thing, let me mention that there is kind of third class of models like VanElle-Straub and original Gabet-Maggiore model where this gamma is there, it's not 0, but it is exogenous. It doesn't depend on the volatility of the exchange rate. And then if you match, this regime under free floating and then switch to the peg, you kind of go here, right? Again, you have this one-to-one translation of the volatility between exchange rates and macro variables, and again, you kind of run into the Musa puzzle. So we think this is not a realistic model in that sense. Okay, so let me conclude by just saying that in the paper we develop a model which we think is realistic. It is consistent with all these exchange rate puzzles. It's tractable. thanks to this linear quadratic approximation, and it's practical in the sense that you can use it to study all these classical policy questions. And as usual, it's better to create jobs in the profession rather than to destroy them. So there are, there are several open questions left, including how do we estimate this currency demand elasticity, right? This gamma. So I think this has been almost done by now. There are several papers which do that, but I think relating this gamma to the volatility of the exchange, that is still very much an open question, right? I mean, we use these macro moments, the Musa puzzle, but of course, it would be much more convincing to get this result also from the micro data. So then also, given that the UIP wedge is the crucial objective for the optimal policy, how do we measure these UIP deviations, right? Again, not ex post UIP deviations, but ex ante, given the expectation term. And again, there's some old literature and more recent literature about that. And then finally, there's this intriguing possibility. We talk about exchange rate policy because this is where we're coming from, but in principle, you can extend this logic to the closed economy, right? So you can ask provocative question like, should the Fed stabilize S&P 500, right? Will that eliminate the risk premium in financial markets, or there is something completely different about stock market, equity market, and other spreads than the UIP wedge that we have in the open economy? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dmitry. It's my privilege of organizing this thing that you can choose the paper you want to discuss. I was saying that it's one of the privilege organizing this thing that you can choose the paper you want to discuss. And this paper is really just a great paper. It's a great end. Is a great sort of conclusion of what is a sort of a great trilogy, which the last chapter is the best. That is the exchange rate disconnect, the Musa puzzle redux, and now this normative addendum to this process. I think that is very specifically what is remarkable, that in this process they keep, you and Oleg keep a very parsimonious structure to the model. No? It's very easy to try to add things and not to really use the Occam razor in ways that really go to the core of the issues. And therefore, that one is very impressive. Make these papers a sort of, they will go directly in reading list everywhere because it's really focused very strongly the mind of what are the big issue when we talk about exchange rate volatility and in this process they confront all the puzzles of exchange rate that we know around the exchange rate and therefore it's not only parsimonious, it's not only consistent, but it's also confronting itself with the puzzle that we know. And therefore it's really very, very impressive. The other thing is, compared to the way we think about financial imperfection, for example, a discussion we had that is also conditional on national structure. Here we're talking about a financial imperfection that really is endogenous to the process of international capital flows. So the financial imperfection is not conditional, it's just the fact that you enter in international capital flows and then endogenously there is a price that you pay, that is the accumulation, so the need to pay arbitrators a sort of the risk premium for them to be part of this financial system. Therefore, it's not a a wedge that you can get away with sort of institutional or national institutional structure is the fact that you are part of that. And also, given that you have this very compact, we can then think about welfare issue and this need to stabilize the exchange rate comes naturally, actually quite simply compared to, I remember other time that was quite difficult to make that appear in the second order approximation. This one comes quite easy. We are particularly talking about excessive exchange rate volatility. Therefore, there is, and I think there is always this monetary policy, or the policymaker operates in this uncertainty space between the exchange rate volatility that you need for international price adjustment, that actually is what you want if you don't have any other instrument, and this excessive volatility that instead is the risk premium that comes from using international arbitration. And this one is really also what I think is really very interesting because then so it becomes also an empirical question. How do we define this? And therefore, the result that in this context, in which you have excessive regional volatility, if you can find a way to manage the interest, the exchange rate, you find a welfare improving condition because, in some sense, what you want is to minimize this volatility that comes from dysfunction of the intermediary, of the international financial intermediary. And in particular, if I understand, is you are really trying to manage these high frequency changes. The real exchange rate move in a sort of business cycle frequency, but really what we want is the shocks to stabilize the shocks of the noisy traders that I think actually don't worry too much about it. Yeah. I wouldn't waste too much time in trying to find a macro foundation to that because it's really so it's an input, is a starting point. And very interested this issue that whatever the monetary policy stay contingent to the stage, to the situation, and this that you can actually stabilize quite a lot if you have very strong anchor on the a commitment to intervention. This forward-looking element is also very interesting. It's a great paper. It's such a really very difficult to discuss for a reason. I think we went through a lot of this discussion over and over. Therefore, you see everywhere in the paper the answer of whatever I'm going to say now. Therefore, it's okay. I'm sure there is a lot of great work there. And this, is really one paper in a picture. I think it was a great idea. And how monetary policy has to operate on these two dimensions. It is about exchange rate policy. Yeah, it's about exchange rate policy, but remember, it's a sort of, therefore, there is three aspects there. One is, therefore, sort of mapping a bit between the paper and the policy context. I want to say something more about what monetary policy can do in that context, and doing something about optimal policy is always optimal. Allora, first of all, the paper does not really define what an optimal foreign intervention is, because my impression is that if you are not constrained in using your forex intervention, then you use everything to absorb all the risk. Therefore, essentially, you become the intermediary. Therefore, instead to have some cost of forex intervention, what you have is you have some constraint to foreign intervention that force monetary policy to find what the optimal trade-off between exchange rate volatility and output volatility should be. Therefore, this one is also mean that in the framework, forex intervention should be used as much as possible, whatever the constraint is. And therefore, we have a system where there is a very powerful forex intervention and a sort of a very constrained, or a monetary policy that is fighting against these two different objectives. And the issue is, can monetary policy, is forex intervention this powerful? And what can monetary policy do more to control exchange rate? Allora, about the power of forex intervention, I think when we want to think about the power of forex intervention, I think it will be useful to think in terms of imperfect information story. Therefore, that you have in the paper, actually, because you discussed this element. When you have imperfect information, therefore, you cannot distinguish between, or easily distinguish between what is fundamental or not, then that, and then the practice of forex intervention, you can see there are a lot of small intervention to smooth, but sort of not risky, or big intervention when the signal is very clear. When you have a big shock, you intervene with forex intervention, or when you have very long, persistent. But that is also costly. Therefore, there is a cost of this, of the persistent. Therefore, imperfect information will put more weight on the monetary policy side. And on the monetary policy side, we are doing a lot of this analysis of different dimensions of monetary policy. Monetary policy is not only interest rate, but there is a lot of other dimensions, in which the most powerful in terms of in the work we do on, but also the work of Georgios yesterday, there is not only the conventional monetary policy is not very powerful, but signal and long-term risk channel of monetary policy can be very powerful in managing and controlling the exchange rate. Therefore, this one is for South Africa. We have this 4 dimension that Giovanni was talking about yesterday. It's really the monetary policy shock, the monetary policy signal that operates at the level of the risk premium, have quite a lot of a significant effect on the expected and long exchange rate. Therefore, the point is, maybe we underestimated the power of monetary policy in a certain context to have a control of exchange rate. We overestimate the absolute power of foreign exchange intervention to control. And finally, this one was in the discussion with Ozer the other day, that reminded me a paper or reflect about when we think about operating monetary policy, we cannot not consider the fact that a certain optimal monetary policy changes the strategic condition against a policymaker. A typical example, where you enter in a monetary union or you have a fixed exchange rate, now the preference of the fiscal authority changes because they don't worry anymore about the inflation or exchange rate effect of that policy. And this one is nothing to do actually with the paper, but it's just a sort of this mapping with the real. And therefore, even if we want to manage the exchange rate, this one must be somehow compatible with the overall policy framework. And therefore, what the fiscal policy is or what the other element of the policy is become important for the sustainability of whatever the... and also by stabilizing the exchange rate, what you could have, you are missing some signal when your other policies are out of sync. Therefore, on this one, I think, and then the usual time consistency problem that when we accumulate foreign exchange reserves, somebody might like to have them. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It was really a great paper. Thank you.
Okay, questions. We started a bit late, so can we eat up from our tea time? Can we eat up? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me maybe respond very quickly. Thanks so much, Nicola. This is really great discussion and several very interesting points. Let me just to economize time. I agree. I mean, clearly we assume monetary dominance and fiscal policy in practice is, of course, very important for emerging economies. I like the way you put it about incomplete information. That's exactly what we try to capture, but of course, once you start modeling it seriously, the model becomes much more complicated, and I'm not sure we can add much to previous literature, but yes, I think that's the key friction. Now, I think the most interesting thing that you said about, and absolutely right, that FX interventions are kind of costless in the model. And it's actually very interesting. I mean, I think this is largely an open question. So what are the costs of FX interventions? Because, I mean, you can say that maybe if you keep dollars, safe assets, then you get lower returns. That's true. But actually, in our model, if you do the optimal policy, then even if some of these arbitrageurs and intermediaries, they are foreign agents, so that you can, there's this profits transfer from the central bank to the rest of the world, it's still always kind of non-negative under the optimal. It can be positive, actually. And so in that sense, we don't get that cost in the model. It's very hard to get it, at least. I think, and we had discussion with Tatiana and I think also with Pierre-Olivier at some time before, that maybe the main cost comes from the fact that the shallowness of this currency market, right, it is endogenous to FX interventions. Maybe the more interventions you do, the more central bank substitutes for these arbitrageurs, the less arbitrageurs will be willing to enter that market. And so the markets endogenously become even more shallow. And that's an interesting thing. I think, so in my view, right, there's this integrated policy framework where I would say kind of everything is exogenous. We make one step forward by assuming that at least arbitrageurs' demand elasticity is endogenous to the volatility of the exchange rate. I think that's the main kind of contribution. And then there's the third step, which I think is very natural, to make the entry of arbitrageurs and maybe even noise traders endogenous, kind of going a little bit back to original Jean and Rose paper, and then to see how maybe FX interventions have also endogenous effect on these entry decisions. But I think that's a great topic for future research. Okay, so.
Okay, thank you. Can we eat into our coffee time a bit? Because, yeah. Questions?
Thank you, Dima. I was wondering, in this model, I would guess the home country is the US, especially because the intermediary is sharing the household stochastic discount factor. And there are some benefits to the US economy, say, from reducing this exchange rate volatility. But the volatility goes both ways, so maybe the other country also benefits from this reduced volatility. I'm wondering if you have any sense of how this works.
Right, so we don't have, I mean, we think mostly about emerging economies. What we do have will then solve for the kind of, we compare local optimal policy to the global optimal policy, right? We put, we look at the world with a continuum of small open economies, and there we get that the first best policy is also globally efficient. So if everyone is doing, monetary policy combined with FX interventions, then you get globally efficient allocation. But if you have that country switch to the second best, let's say only use monetary policy to smooth movements in exchange rates, then it will be suboptimal from the global perspective, right? So in particular, US is doing something, and then all countries want to smooth the exchange rate movements against the dollar, so they will effectively import US monetary stance. And even FX intervention, if some countries are constrained and other countries are free to choose whatever FX policy they want, they will do it inefficiently because they take the global interest rate as given. They don't internalize the fact that there was inefficient capital inflow or outflow from other countries. But yeah, I didn't have time to talk about it, but I agree, it's a very interesting next step.
Thank you. And very short question. Is there some form of insurance for the resubversion of the intermediary?
Insurance for intermediaries?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's okay. So that's exactly right, in the sense that there is no insurance in the model, but what the central bank does is effectively the insurance, right? So I didn't have time to talk about that, but even if the central bank doesn't have any reserves, but it can, trade derivatives and swaps in the currency market, then it can kind of, take the risk provide effectively insurance to the financial markets, and that is sufficient to achieve the policy goals, right? You don't really need foreign currency. You just need to take away this currency risk, and so derivatives are enough for that. So it's really about, you're absolutely right that in a sense it's all about insurance, and the central bank can provide that insurance.
So just for fun, suppose I write a version of your model in the currency union, and now the noise traders are buying the domestic bonds of the different member countries. Would you say the central bank of the currency union needs to come in and intervene on the bond markets to limit the fluctuations that you may have in the yields, as we have seen some central banks doing in some currency unions?
Okay, so in currency union, they don't need to do that, right? That's exactly because the exchange rate is not moving, so Italian bond and German bond become perfect substitutes in our model, and so whatever noise traders want to do will be completely offset by arbitrageurs, and central bank doesn't need to do any FX interventions. Of course, they're not perfect substitutes in real world, right? I guess because of default risk. And so that's a very small extension that I think we have in the appendix. So if you introduce currency risk, so that even under fixed exchange rate, they're not perfect substitutes, then it's true that having fixed exchange rate is actually a bad idea, right? Because in a sense, in normal times, that makes them more substitutable, and the countries will accumulate larger positions. But then once you have, let's say, exogenous increase in the default, right, you will have very fecal capital flows. But you are right, I mean, we don't do this exercise, but I presume that if the central bank can do, of course, then it should just offset it with the FX interventions. But yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone.